Get started, I want to ask a favor of everybody in the room. This is not going to make a lot of sense right now, but it will make sense tonight at about 9 o'clock at Bad Voltage Live. So I'm going to record a very short video. Now, what I'd like you all to do at the same time is to say, "We all hate Stuart Langridge," okay? So when I do, I'm going to count down.
You know he's in the room.
Yeah, I know. 3, 2, 1, and then... Hang on.
We all hate Jono Bacon.
All right. Thank you for that. More will be revealed tonight. Okay, thank you everybody for coming along. I wasn't expecting if anyone was going to show up because, you know, I left Canonical about 9 months ago and I thought everyone was going to be like, all right, see you later. For those of you who don't know me, I used to work with this motley crew. George is not included in that picture because he defected and went to the dark side of Canonical. I used to run the community team at Canonical and I was there for just under 8 years, and it was by far and away the best experience I've ever had in my life. It was just an incredible journey, an incredible roller coaster. And the presentation today is basically to walk through that roller coaster, is to talk about what's happened and how we got to the point we've got to today, as well as to have a discussion about where we are today with Ubuntu and whether we think it's going to be successful, and then also to talk a little bit about the future as well and what's in store for Ubuntu as well as Canonical. Now, I'm going to go through this. And one thing should be made very abundantly clear: I have a peanut for a brain, and consequently, I don't remember everything, and I'm probably going to remember some of these things in the wrong order. It was a bit of a trip down memory lane going through this. So I'm expecting some of you to shout out, "No, it didn't work that way," but this is my best recollection of some of the things that happened. But this is also very much of a personal story. Just because I experienced it this way doesn't necessarily mean that anybody else experienced it in the same way as well, okay? So let's start out with the past. So we all love to come to scale and reminisce about how we first got interested in Linux. For me, it was this book, which is so old there isn't a high-resolution picture of it on the internet anymore. I bought this in 1998. My brother told me about Linux, and he said, you know, he was basically mocking me for using Windows. He said it was a quote-unquote Mickey Mouse operating system. So I bought this book, and I plugged it in, and I just captivated immediately. I was terrified but captivated at the same time. And it was the community aspect that really fascinated me. People getting together to create things where, you know, as a 18-year-old in England, living in a nowhere village, that I could play a part of this bigger global movement, I thought was just unbelievable, and it was captivating from day one. Getting interested in Linux, it became abundantly clear that the goal here was to create an amazing desktop experience for people. And the amazing desktop experience back then looked like this. It wasn't all that amazing, and it looked quite like Windows. So this is FVWM95, and there was many, many different options back then. And shortly after getting interested in Linux and participating a little bit, it became evident that there were some new efforts that were moving forward to make this kind of consumer-friendly desktop operating system. And this was kind of a weird notion back then, because Linux back then, you had to have a beard and no C to participate. And so consequently, some of the best options we had were, for example, KDE. So KDE was really kind of lighting the charge in terms of moving forward, creating something that was easy to use. KDE was revolutionary because you didn't have to manually configure configuration files, for example. They had GUI tools to configure your system, which was weird back in sort of 1999. So this produced this sense of kind of excitement that, you know, we all know that we can contribute. The world is our oyster. We could all make something that's just user-friendly and easy and powerful, that can help kids in schools, that can help people to learn, people to set up small businesses, help disadvantaged people all over the world. Now, in my view, I started out with Slackware, and Slackware was kind of, you know, the nuts and bolts of Linux thrown together in a tin. But there are distributions who were trying to make this easier as well, and one of the first ones really was Red Hat. and I think I started using this back in Red Hat 5 sort of days, or Red Hat 4, something like that. And this was really, again, quite different. The notion of an RPM was just alien technology back then, you know, when you're compiling your kernel every day. But Red Hat in itself was still quite complicated. So shortly after that, and some of you, all this will be very familiar, there was Mandrake. And Mandrake is when we started seeing things really kind of starting to roll. This is the Ubuntu that never happened, as far as I'm concerned. And I feel a little bit sad for them because it's been like the longest death of a company ever. It's like just dragged out. Knoppix? Right. Yeah, Canonical was pretty relevant, like the live CD aspect. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't really fit into this time, but I think that played a really important role. Now, I remember back when I was using Mandrake, and I was going to a Linux user group meeting that I set up in Wolverhampton, which is an awful place in England. And my friend and compadre, who you all mocked on the video, Stuart Langridge, who sat right there, he was whittling on at me over and over and over and again about using Debian. And all of the problems I was experiencing in Red Hat and Mandrake, things around package installation, all the rest of it, he was going on about that you should use Debian. It solves all of those problems. But Debian looked and felt like Slackware to me. So we were in this position where we had a distribution like Mandrake that was really easy to use at the time, and that has all of these complexities around it in terms of maintaining a good system. And then you've got Debian, which is unbelievably elegant in how you set up packages and set up systems, but is remarkably complicated in getting running. So the thing that we used to talk about over and over again was what we really want is an easy-to-use Debian, right? That's exactly what we need to have. And one of the first efforts at this, and we were obviously just fans, just, you know, Linux fans hanging out, having a beer and a curry in a Linux user group. One of the first ones was Corel Linux. Anyone remember this? Yeah, I bought that box as well. And it was, again, this is like such a great opportunity. There was a few of these. There was like Xandros and Corel Linux and, yeah, exactly. And it was, again, this was a great opportunity, but it was a little too early, all right? Around this sort of time, a friend of mine called Scott James Remnant, who used to work at Canonical, who's now at Google, he mentioned that he'd been hired by some rich millionaire guy. And there wasn't a name for it back then, but we now know that it was called Canonical. And I remember going to a Linux user group meeting in Birmingham with Jeff Waugh, who used to be with the GNOME project, and they were talking about we're going to make the dream, easy-to-use Debian. And this excited me, and it excited Stuart. And this was before Warty was released, and this was the group of people who put it together. Okay, this is the original gangsters of Ubuntu. What I love is just how unbelievably unimpressed he is. And knowing James Troop, that's not a surprise. And also this guy, right, Matt Zimmerman, not impressed as well. I used to work for him, so I can talk shit about him. So this was the group, and this is Scott James Remnant, the guy that I was talking about. Amazing group of people, and they put together Warty, which completely changed the Linux landscape as far as I was concerned. So I started using Warty like a bunch of other people, and a couple of releases passed, and then I joined Canonical. This is my first picture ever taken at Ubuntu Developer Summit, wearing a decapitated T-shirt, and that stupid beard. I joined in 2006. And so in the past, we've had all of these different releases. And I spent time at Canonical working on this group of releases. So we were releasing every 6 months, repeatedly. And what we ended up doing was, there was elements of the formula of releasing Ubuntu that we maintained and was consistent, but then we'd also change things around. So we'd, the Ubuntu Developer Summits and the way we planned things, we eventually started moving more towards work items and blueprints and this, that, and the other. But it was the same basic principle that the benefit of a 6-month cadence, Mark Shuttleworth talks about this all the time, the benefit of a 6-month cadence is that you get to refine and improve yourself every 6 months. So what happened is, this janky startup of people living in their bedrooms was able to refine how you build an operating system really quite quickly. And I believe that we really started hitting our stride around the hardy and intrepid time. That's when we really started knowing how to do this. Before then, it was like a little bit all over the place. But Ubuntu started seeing a reputation of, it just works. And that was the thing. It just works. And of course, for Linux, that was quite simple stuff compared to the proprietary world. I can plug a USB stick in. Wow! And then a window appears on the screen. That was revolutionary back then when the kernel had no idea about what was going on with the USB stick. So Warty was thrown out the door and started changing things. But Warty was really designed for these things: desktop computers and, to a degree, laptops. And, if you wanted to get things like multi-monitor working, it was a little bit complicated. But Warty was very much focused on the machines that the developers were building it on, and ended up being reasonably successful. A little while later, 6.06 came out, which was our very first LTS release, and that's when the Ubuntu landscape started embracing the server as well. So we now had effectively one engineering management team at Canonical. It was run by Matt Zimmerman, and then there was multiple teams within it. You had, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but you had a server team, you had a desktop team. So on the desktop side of things, you had like 10 guys building Ubuntu, and then 10 people on the server side, and then some people doing like kernel and other bits and pieces. So around this sort of time, 2006, 2007, heading towards 2008, it was just a remarkable period of change. We were getting together for sprints every 3 months or every 6 months, and just working through the night and trying to get this thing together. And there was police forces and educational institutions. We had a guy who ran an education program at Canonical. We had somebody who ran training programs. Like, the world was our oyster. And it was just about going out there and making some of this stuff, right? Easy, right? We've got a free product. Loads of people want to buy it. The challenge is, with this is that the real sticking point that Canonical struggled with over the years is that pesky thing called the Ubuntu Promise. And it basically says that we will build a free open source platform for everybody. And there are lots of different open source companies out there who make money, but invariably a lot of them who actually make money with open source software compromise on their ideals in some way. Now, everyone's definition of ideals is different. You've got the Free Software Foundation about 500 miles in that direction, and then you've got kind of the rest of us over here. But if you don't have per seat licensing, or you don't have lockdown servers, something like that, it's actually quite hard to make money in certain ways with open source. But the one thing that I admire about Canonical, and this is really Mark Shuttleworth, he has never wavered on this for 1 second, is that Ubuntu will always be free, and I trust him when he says that. So back then, this is basically how the team worked. You had Mark Shuttleworth, who was, I like to nickname him Space Boss. He was at the top of the tree, and then we had the Ubuntu engineering team, who was run by Matt Zimmerman. I was on this engineering team running this one. We had the kernel team run by this guy called Ben Collins, who he introduced me to Jägermeister, so don't ever meet him in a bar. It was a bad experience. And then we had like the foundations team run by Colin Watson for a short period of time, Rick Clark, who went on to do OpenStack server, and then Scott James Revenant on desktop. Now, what happened around this sort of time was we were making money to a degree, but we were fundamentally constrained, and some of you may be critical of the word constrained in this setting, constrained by the upstream relationship that we had. So what Ubuntu was effectively doing was taking lots of open source pieces, putting it together into a platform, and then shipping it. And that's what Linux distributions did. But the difficulty with that is that the only advantage that you really have is being first. And when you release every 6 months, and other distributions are now releasing every 6 months, you don't have a lot of being first time. So yes, it was great back then because you could get the brand new GNOME, and you could get the brand new X and the brand new kernel, and you could get it from Ubuntu, but then 3 months later you'd get it in Fedora and you get it in elsewhere. So it's quite difficult to differentiate in some kind of way. And this is when we started thinking, and I wasn't really involved in these discussions, this was primarily Mark. This is when the thinking was about, well, why don't we differentiate a little bit with Ubuntu? And the team was adjusted to look a little bit like this. So you had the Ubuntu engineering team, all like this. A couple of people stepped down here. And then Mark created the design team. Now, this is important. That design team is important for a few reasons. This was the first time in Canonical where product definition and development was happening outside of the team that was actually building it. And that's weird for a lot of reasons, okay? Inside the Ubuntu engineering team, there was, all of the knowledge about how you build Ubuntu was basically living in there in Canonical. Now what was happening is you had these people who were coming in to a new startup company who didn't really have a lot of knowledge about how a Linux distribution is put together, but could design something without those constraints. And I think that was actually a really good thing, because you had all of this creativity and all of these remarkable ideas coming in about building something genuinely new. The difficulty is it caused quite a lot of consternation at Canonical. And there was a bit of a us and them kind of thing between the design team and the Ubuntu engineering team to a degree. And if I'm being honest, part of the reason why the design team was set up was because there was a resistance in the Ubuntu engineering team to do this. So Mark basically was like, okay, two can play that game. I'll set up another team. And it was the right thing for Canonical, but as we'll get to later on, it caused some controversy. So what then happened was just this blistering streak of like UDSs and events. When I hang out with Canonical people, we often reminisce about these times because it was like being on tour with Motley Crue. It was just breakneck kind of work. Like there was no sleep. Like you go to a UDS. I remember meeting my wife, being in Prague, and calling her every night, and she was going to bed, and I was in Europe. It was like there was basically no sleep. Everyone was just rocking and rolling because there was so much passion. We had this sense of we can really change the world with this. Like this is brand new, this is different, and because we've got this design component, we've got something that's unique to us. Okay, so really the first release that kicked this out was 8.10. And in 8.10, this appeared. Notify OSD. An innocent-looking speech bubble to most. A wildly disruptive open source innovation to the open source community. This was quite controversial because what we were starting to do here was differentiate a little bit from our upstreams. The GNOME project were not happy about this. And I'm not going to air loads of dirty laundry, but there was an effort back in those days to do all of this work with Unity within the GNOME project. And my view on this is that both sides acted stupidly. The GNOME project were unnecessarily resistant to change and ideas and differences, but then Canonical was kind of a bull in a china shop about it. And I hold myself partially responsible for this. But there was an effort to try and do this within the GNOME project, but it was quite evident that this wasn't going to work out, despite best efforts. And there was a lot of kind of political discussions behind the scenes about how we can move this forward, and a lot of remarkable people on both sides of the equation who were trying to move this in the right direction. But ultimately, it basically made sense, well, we have to do this outside of GNOME. And this was really the first step. If you're trying to differentiate with your product and do something new in an upstream, you don't just consider the code that you write. This is one of the things that frustrated me at times about some of the reaction to this stuff, is that people only look at the code being written. But in reality, what's more important than the code are the relationships. So if you build something and it's in somebody else's code base, and those people are actively against what you're doing or resistant to what you're doing, you're going to spend your entire life fighting. And sometimes it makes sense to just say, look, in the spirit of collaboration, but also competition, let's just do things a little differently. Now, this wasn't the only thing around this time. Ubuntu One was another thing. So, Ubuntu not trying to compromise its ethics of openness and freedom of access and all the rest of it. One great way in which you can make some money is services. This was the Dropbox before Dropbox. And again, this was difficult. This was a difficult time. Part of the reason for this was because the word Ubuntu was in the term Ubuntu One. And for some members of our community, they felt like you shouldn't associate a commercial service with the trademark Ubuntu. So there was some lots of subtleties and discussions around this. And what was interesting about this, from my perspective, is that all of these debates and discussions, and in some cases arguments, were actually really good for us because it was testing the relationship between a collaborative community and a commercial entity in ways that had not really been done before. I wasn't aware of any other organization that had these kinds of challenges. And ultimately, things started moving in the right direction. Now, 10.10. This was Maverick, I think. I always forget the names. This is when you first saw Unity. Who remembers Unity coming into the Ubuntu world? Yeah, I've skipped over you and I. This was a very, 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 very controversial move on Canonical's part. And it was, without a shadow of doubt, like for me, I was sadly at the kind of the brunt of a lot of this stuff. One of the great things about being a community manager is that you get way more credit than you deserve. Like, I go to conferences and people come up and say, "Thank you for Ubuntu." Like, it's just me. Like, I'd love to take the credit, but there's lots of people who feed into this. But one of the downsides of being a community manager is people come up and say, "You moved the freaking Windows buttons to the wrong side of the window." So it just lit up like a Christmas tree, and we were just being yelled at from all sides. And there were some people who were saying this is a great thing, some people were saying this is not a great thing, blah 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 blah. And what this really did is it ushered in a new era for Ubuntu, an era that we could never go back to the way things were. Like, we could never go back to just shipping, the latest, greatest open source crack, which is the way we described it back in the old days. There are derivatives and flavors who do this, like Ubuntu, for example, and Kubuntu, but the core Ubuntu could never go back to that because the path has now been trodden. And what this new era really said was that we're going to take control of our destiny. Is that we're going to look at Ubuntu and we're going to build something that we believe is the right step forward. Because part of the contention with all of this was the upstream-downstream relationship. So for those of you who don't know the lingo, upstreams are projects like GNOME and X and the kernel, all these individual open source projects that we bring together into a distribution. Downstream is the distribution. So the way, invariably what you do is you take these upstream pieces and you bring them in, you put them into the distribution. And there's a set of social conventions there that are relatively unspoken, but people expect. So, for example, upstreams generally don't like you adjusting what they've got. So, like, if you take GNOME and you configure it outside of, like, some theme changes, maybe some a default background and stuff like that, if you start adding your own pieces in there, upstream gets pretty pissed off pretty quickly. And it's not just GNOME, it's lots of different projects who do that. The other thing is that upstreams generally just expect their software to be shipped. Right? They don't in many cases, upstreams don't actually care about which distributions they appear in, so long as they get shipped and as long as they hit users. Downstreams do care about that. They care about making sure that they can meet those users, but downstreams, in many cases, don't really care as much about the upstream process. You also have different types of support and expectations. So, for example, with an upstream, very, very few people use an upstream like by building it manually. Like, how many people in this room, this is probably a bad question for this audience, how many people in this room have built GNOME from scratch? That guy, right? How many of you have used GNOME in a distribution? Basically the rest of you, okay? So that means that the people who are providing feedback and perspectives to upstreams are going to be a different type of person than people who are going to be providing feedback and perspectives to, to the downstream. So you get like the same product or the same piece, GNOME, but lots of different viewpoints and different expectations about how that stuff works. This is a contention that will always exist. By Canonical basically deciding to build Unity and deciding to build these different pieces, it essentially said to the upstream-downstream relationship, we're gonna do what we think is right in some areas, and things that aren't right, we're gonna kind of not use your stuff in other areas. This caused a lot of problems with GNOME and KDE. The GNOME project, who we'd had a wonderful relationship with for many years, were really quite irritated by this. And I don't blame them. You basically take something that you were doing, and were doing quite well, and then you decide to completely change it or move it out of the way. However, there was a lot of efforts to try and do this within the GNOME camp and to do it well. So I sympathize with both sides of the equation. KDE has basically always been annoyed with Canonical, so that wasn't too much of a surprise. But this did really usher in kind of a quite kind of awkward era. And one of the lessons that I learned at a later date that I didn't really pick up back then, and it's one regret that I do have is that I didn't realize this back then. And some of you are going to say, well, yeah, when you see this, is that true open source development is actually quite inefficient. Because if you have a community project, you have people who are working together on a code base, you don't just get to go and make unilateral decisions. If you want to build something as a team, you have to work in the team. And one of the challenges with all open source communities is that it's not like you only have really good people working on that thing. You have a lot of noise. You'll have a lot of people who are passionate, they've got great intentions, and they really want the best for a particular project, but they don't really know what they're doing. And then they weigh into things, and things get sidetracked and derailed, and people have to be overly politically correct, and this, that, and the other. But if you want to do real open source development, and you want it to be a really collaborative project, that's just part of the deal. Is that part of the, if I was to sound like a marketing moron, the opportunity cost, is that you have to take into account that there's a lot of this kind of faffing about to ultimately get to the point where you ship something. Now, the DIY approach, when you just build it, is efficient, right? You can just say, okay, well, we're just going to do this, but it's less scalable. It's very hard to build a community around a unilateral set of decisions that you're not involved in. And this has been the challenge, I think, that Canonical has faced with Unity, is that Unity, and let us be clear about this, is completely open source. You can go and get it today. Any distribution can ship it. Anybody can run it. You can contribute to it. If you want to build a feature or a patch, you can build it. You can contribute to it. There's tons of great developer documentation like that. Michael Hull, who I used to work with, has done a remarkable job making this as easy as possible to participate in Unity. But I believe that one of the reasons why there's been relatively low traction in that is because I think people who want to participate in an open source project want to feel like they could ultimately get to the point where they can make the decisions. And the difficulty with Unity, being completely frank, is those decisions are made by the Canonical design team. They're not made by the community. And I think that was a relatively intentional decision, and I think for Ubuntu that was the right decision. Because I don't know if any of you have ever participated in a community design discussion. It's not very good. With relative exceptions, it just goes off, like you're bike shedding. It just goes off the beaten path for 100 miles. So you face this position where you want to do something different, you want to do something interesting, and it's great to get on with it, but this really did cost the community to a reasonable extent with Ubuntu. However, I think it was the right decision. And it was the right decision because, well, first of all, I own one of these now, and this is awesome, and this could not have been done if everybody had a say. I hate to say it, but it could not have been done if everybody had a say. It was and I'll get to this in a second, but the amount of engineering that went into that phone is just remarkable. So sometimes you've just got to get on and pedal, but there is a cost at that. So the community that we now have around Ubuntu is a different type of community. It's what we've always had with the loco teams and the advocates and things like that. But now it's about app developers and about people writing scopes and things like that. It's more of a consumer community, and I think that's actually a healthier balance, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So, 11/10, I remember this vividly. We had an Ubuntu Developer Summit in Orlando, and Mark Shuttleworth got on the stage, and I'll always remember this, that we'd been talking for a little while about doing this, about building all these devices. I went out to a UDS in Budapest, I think it was, and Mark came up to me and was like, "We're going to do it." And I didn't know I said, "What do you mean?" And you'd never want him to say that to you, because that could mean, are we going to space? Do you need a cup of coffee? I mean, like, he was like, we're going to build Ubuntu, and it's going to run on everything. And I said to him, you're going to need a lot of engineering for that. He said, we're going to hire him. He said, I've put in a head count to Jane, who was CEO, for 150 people. I'm like, okay. I like how he said, I put in a head count. Like, that matters. It's like, you'll get it. Right. Filled out the form. So, at the UDS after that, we talked about this. And Mark basically said, we want to build Ubuntu for all these different devices. We got mailing lists set up. We got all this stuff set up. This is going to be incredible, but we want your input. We want your guidance. And that UDS was just brilliant. We had so much community interest and participation. And at this time, a lot of the fire and the flame around the switch to Unity had kind of died down. Like, the community had settled with the fact that Unity is really something that, yes, you can collaborate with if you want to, like people were fixing bugs and paper cuts and stuff like that, but it has been driven to a reasonable extent by Canonical. But there's still so much other stuff we want to do. We want to build an SDK. We want to build a development platform. In fact, we had to build all of these different things. You know, a lot of people look at the Ubuntu phone, and by the way, if you haven't bought one of these, go out and buy one of these when you can, because this thing is amazing. We got I know Stuart's got one, I've got one, but what went into doing this was remarkable, because there was Unity A, and everybody thinks about, you know, building the phone and the tablet and everything is just Unity, but it really isn't. You've got a set of platform services, things like how do you set an alarm when the screen's off on a phone, when you need to conserve battery? How do you deal with push notifications? How do you deal with media playback? All of those things had to be built, not just for a desktop, but cognizant of these wider platforms. How do you build a display server that's going to run on a phone and run on everything else as well? And again, controversial decision, but I think it was the right one to go to Mir, because it's really super slick. This thing runs Mir. And Mir was just, you know, an idea in a bar one night that turned into this in next to no time, because it's a very, very focused, directed effort to get something done. Things like app insulation. If you're going to build a mobile phone, you don't want people building Debian packages to run on it, right? How many people have built a Debian package here? Yeah, it's hard, right? Because you've got all this policy, and Debian packages run with maintainer scripts, and if you know, these maintainer scripts run as root, and if you screw that up, then you can wipe people's systems. That's why you should never, ever, ever, ever download a deb from the Ubuntu forum, right? Just never do that, whatever it might be. So we need to build app installation to make sure that people can build packages and upload them to the store. You know, back then, if you wanted to add an application into Ubuntu, you had to build a Debian package and get it into release before we released Ubuntu. If you were halfway through an Ubuntu release and you had a new version of a package, you were out of luck. There was no way of getting a new version into Ubuntu. And the first step around that was something called the, I've forgotten. Application Review Board, which was kind of a watered-down version of what we have now. And it was basically a simple way in which you could try and get things in, but it was clumsy, and it relied on a community team who did their best to try and review all these packages, but they just ran out of time. What you want is you want a developer to build something and then press a button, and then it goes into the store and it's ready, and they can release as often as they want. So we had to build that for Ubuntu, and that was a ridiculous amount of work. So again, that's something you don't really see. You see the store where you can go and download the app and you can review it, but that's just that's the top layer of this massive mountain of work that had to be done. Things like the Ubuntu SDK. There was no SDK back then. If you want to build an application for Ubuntu, you can use PyGTK or GTK. You can write it in C, Vala, C++. You could write it in 100 different languages with 100 different toolkits. And we want consistency because you're building a set of platform services. So, you know, I've mentioned this before, but I cannot emphasize enough how much work went into building this with a fairly small team of people. I think it was probably about 80 to 100 people who worked on this, who worked just an unnameable amount of hours to kind of build this and deliver this, but it was the right thing, I think, moving forward. But this caused disruption. And, you know, there was frustration in the community because people didn't like the fact that this was, that in a way, people were kind of less involved. And the thing I find ironic about this is that the people who were doing the complaining invariably were the people who would never contribute anyway. Because some people use open sources. Right. In my mind, if you're doing something in a way to help Ubuntu, then we want to hear your opinion, we want to hear your perspective, because you've earned your right to have an opinion and a perspective at the table. If you're just reading OMG Ubuntu, you're treating open source like a religion. Like when I was community manager, I said to somebody, I was like, frankly, I'm not interested in your opinion. Not interested. It doesn't benefit us in any way, right? Everybody's got ideas, everybody's got perspective, everybody's got feedback, and that's great. But sometimes you've got to just get on and do something. And part of this was that I think some people in the open source community, certainly not everybody, treat open source like it's a massive online role-playing game, where you get karma and points, you get hit points for when you outswerve somebody who's trying to make a point. And it just turns into this bubbling melting pot of arguing and debating. And we saw a lot of this. And a lot of it was deeply unconstructive. The policy that we've always had from day one in Ubuntu is that we welcome all opinions, all perspectives, so long as they're shared politely and respectfully. And if you've contributed, we listen to your opinion a bit more. So, for example, there was a guy called Scott Ritchie, maintained Wine for Ubuntu for a long time, deeply critical of a lot of stuff that we were doing. But Scott's, the way he expressed it and the way he emphasized it was so elegant, and even though it was deeply critical, it was so elegant that we sat down and talked and hashed things out and moved the debate forward. But all of this trolling and fighting online was just ridiculous. And part of the challenge of this, and this is probably the most controversial slide I've ever put up in a presentation before, you can't really fire community members very easily. The simple reality, where Ubuntu was a little different to a lot of open source projects, like I said, back in '98 when we were all running FVWM 95, back in those days, if you participated in Linux and open source, you were generally pretty hardcore. Even if you wanted to write documentation, you had to know a programming language, LaTeX. And consequently, what happened is open source communities generally had pretty technical, experienced individuals. So even though people might see things from different perspectives, invariably those people had the chops to actually be engaged in the discussion. When I joined Canonical, my goal was I want the Ubuntu community to be a place where anyone can play, right? Where you don't have to be a C developer, where if you're passionate and you're an advocate or you're a great artist or a designer, there's a way in which you can be a part of our mission, that everybody's got a place to play. The challenge with that is you get a lot of hangers-on. You get a lot of people who join that got so much passion, they love what we're doing, they love the goals and the ethos and all that kind of stuff. But they don't really have a lot to contribute. But because they are on the mailing lists and they're on the IRC channels and they watch the Hangouts, they feel like they have an opinion that should be listened to. And this is a meritocracy, right? You earn respect. Just showing up to IRC channels and Hangouts doesn't necessarily do that for you. So consequently, what happened is we had a lot of people who were very, very critical who didn't really contribute anything. So what they did is they were constantly yelling and yelling and yelling and just demotivating the people who were doing the good work. And this was something that we were constantly having conversations about behind the scenes, was how do we deal with this? Because you can't tell that person, and I'm obviously not going to name any specific people, but you can't tell that person to go away. You know, Ubuntu Community Manager tells community members to get stuffed. Like, that's not a headline that I want to see. Sorry? RMS, yeah. Who? Anyway, it was this difficult thing where we had a community that was doing great work, a community that was frustrated, and then a lot of kind of fire and flame. And luckily, I think most of that's frankly died down now. I don't see as much fire and flame these days. Now, we've got to fit this into the wider story. That I've talked about the phone and the convergence story, but there's actually a lot of different pieces that have happened over the years. I've missed out the cloud entirely. But over the years, if you look at what we've done at Canonical, there's Launchpad, Bazaar, Ubuntu, Unity, Mir, Landscape, Ubuntu One, the Ubuntu SDK, Juju, and countless other things. These are all individual projects that have been worked on and built. And again, all of these different things have all been built within the spirit of openness, with the exception of Landscape, which I think is still proprietary, right? Yeah. Everything else, I mean, Launchpad was proprietary for a bit and then it was open sourced. But Mark is absolutely steadfast. Like we're building an open platform, okay? So it turns out, if you look at the history of Canonical from day one and all the things that Canonical has built, all the different platforms and products and all the rest of it, this is really what Canonical is trying to do, to build an open, free, community-centric, profitable, scalable, efficient platform. That's pretty hard. And this is one of the reasons why I miss working at Canonical, is because every single person at that company has absolutely the right intentions. And that's what made going through that process and all that conflict so difficult, was I was seeing people making unfounded accusations and in some cases threats towards colleagues and friends who I knew had absolutely the right intentions, who were doing this for the right reasons, who were doing it to do this. It just wasn't the right flavor of freedom. to some people. So it was pretty hard. But I think that where we got to now, if we look at that story, is we've gone from making a pretty Debian to now having an operating system that can run on a desktop, a phone, a tablet, a TV, a toaster, anything else, right? We're in a good space. All of that difficulty that we went through, I think, was worth it. And it was worth it for open source. It wasn't just worth it for Canonical, because everything is open source. And every piece of code can be forked if you need it to be. So let's talk about the present. I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to blast through this fairly quickly, of where things are going. I just want to share some thoughts and musings on where we are right now. So first of all, this thing. How many of you have run Ubuntu on a phone? Yeah? Ah, cool. So I'm super impressed with this. I flew out a couple of weeks ago to this Insiders event in London. Stuart was there as well. And we were given these phones. And it was, Jordan Keys was there. We were given these phones, and we'd been running them on Nexus 4s for a while, but to see it on a real commercial handset with with aggregate scopes and all the rest of it was cool. And I think this is a really, really solid first commercial incarnation. It's not perfect. There are still a few bugs in there. But the thing I like about this more than anything is that it's different. If you look at Firefox OS, if you look at Yola, they're kind of doing the same thing that's already being done, but in a different way. It's the app grid. Firefox is neat because they're targeting, developing nations and things like that, which I'm really passionate about. I think we should be doing that. But it's basically the same kind of formula. With this, you don't get an app grid when you switch the phone on. You get scopes. And it takes you right to the content. It's completely different. It's very much focused on getting you to where you want to get to. So, for example, in London, we picked up these things, and we were about to go to a bar, and we went to the nearby scope and selected that we want to go and have a drink somewhere. I'm thirsty, and it told us bars within walking distance. No loading up the Yelp app and doing this and doing that. It took us there. It was really quick and easy. So I think it's a really, really cool, different, neat idea. Is it going to work in the market? It's too early to tell. It is too early to tell because it is so different that it won't be for everybody. The way Canonical's releasing this is by having a bunch of these flash sales. And this is good for gauging demand. It's good for demonstrating demand. It provides a way in which we're targeting the people like you folks, enthusiasts, people who are passionate about Ubuntu first, because you want to have that base in there to kind of build apps and use the scopes and provide feedback and provide input on it. So when we create the first version that will actually hit the mass market, it'll be suitable for the mums and dads of the world. So I'm very excited about this, and I believe it's all to play for. Let's now talk about the desktop. Where do we stand with this? That's a pretty nice laptop, isn't it? See, I'll take care of you. System 76, wonderful creator of laptops. Go and get your Ubuntu laptops. You can also win a Gallagher Ultra Pro laptop tonight at Live Voltage. So be sure, Bad Voltage Live. So go there. In fact, you can win it by ranting for 60 seconds. So if you hate something, practice. I'm giving you all a heads up because you're all Ubuntu people, so you're all great people. Think about something that really annoys you, right? And practice ranting about it for 60 seconds, right? And then show up tonight, and you might be able to win a System 76 laptop. The desktop is, for all intents and purposes, right now in maintenance mode, right? It does its thing, and it works well. However, what's going on behind the scenes, of course, the behind the scenes in terms of like the releases, is Unity 8 converging. And the desktop team is run by this guy called Bill, who is Stuart's best friend from being like 2 years old, who is just a wonderful individual. And they're already like, there's window buttons and all these kinds of things that are coming in, so it really looks like a desktop. And it's going to be awesome. I can't wait to see Unity 8 when it hits a stable release. So looking good there. And then of course we have convergence. What do we think about convergence right now? In my mind, convergence is cool, but I don't think it's why people buy products. Convergence is great for building a platform that can ultimately target other things. So if we hadn't gone the convergence route with Ubuntu, we'd just have a server operating system, and we'd just have a a desktop operating system. There'd be no option for phones and tablets and everything else. But all that work that I was talking about, all that engineering and design, all the rest of it that's gone into it, has now built a platform that you could potentially scale out to multiple areas. Watches and wearables and other things. It's all to play for. So it means that we have a much more nimble platform than we've ever had before. So I think convergence is great for us as people who are enthusiastic about Ubuntu. It's great for people like System 76 who are building products. It's great for Canonical who are fielding a lot of this work. So this is great, but this is not the reason why I believe people buy devices. I think that when you have a laptop and a tablet and you have a watch and you have a phone and you have a toaster on the market, then people may buy it because of that. But right now, it's not going to be why people buy it because of that. The cloud. I've left out the cloud almost entirely here because, frankly, I'm not a great authority on it. But Ubuntu and Canonical is just doing amazing work with the cloud. I mean, all the major clouds, setting up private clouds, you're constantly hearing Ubuntu in the press about this, and I think this is super exciting. Canonical is almost two businesses. It's a client side and it's a cloud side, and they're kind of different. They're like two different startups almost in the same company. So George and Marco, for example, work on the cloud side of things, and they're just doing incredible work, and it's amazing watching Ubuntu flourish out there. What about the community? We talked a lot about the community in this session. I think that we went through this difficult transition. We lost some people. We gained some people. But I believe the community is strong, and it's super passionate about Ubuntu as it's always been. And I actually feel like we have a healthier community today than we've ever had. Because we have a community today that's frankly realistic, that has an idea about, okay, in anything in the world, you've got lines drawn in certain areas. Like there's a line for this and a line for that, and it's not, the Hunger Games, and it's not a free-for-all. And I feel like we have a great community. We got communities who are like a bunch of the default apps that ship on the phone were written by community members. A bunch of QA was done by community members. I had a guy came up to me yesterday who's been doing a bunch of ISO testing. The community is, I think, doing really well. I think we're healing from a lot of this conflict that we've had, and now it's fading into the past, and now our community will continue to grow. And people such as Michael and the rest of the community team at Canonical, I can't think of a better group of people to lead this and move it forward. So let's talk about the future. As I wrap this up, the future is an open book. It's difficult to tell because, I mean, anyone who listens to Bad Voltage will know that I'm awful at predictions. So I'm gonna give you some predictions in a bit. I think that we can look at I believe it's better to look at the attributes of what we have to help guide us into predicting what the future is going to look like. So I think we have some reasons to be thankful and we have some reasons to be cautious. Mark Shuttleworth, very good reason to be thankful. This guy, he's a love it or hate him kind of guy. He's brilliant, and Ubuntu cannot succeed without him. He's a unique mind, unbelievable talents in design, in engineering. He challenges the norm. You know, he knows what he wants to go out and get, and he'll go out and get it. You have to be a very specific kind of individual to work very closely with him, because like all founders, he's a bit mad. But he's brilliant, and I'm so glad that we have him continue to be involved in Ubuntu. Another reason to be thankful, the Ubuntu engineering team are just one of the most brilliant group of people I've ever known. All of them. They're absolutely fantastic. Under the leadership of Rick Spencer, who was a wonderful guy as well. They are the backbone for a lot of the stuff that you're seeing on this. They're all probably like on a desert island somewhere right now. Now it's shipped. The other thing, another reason to be thankful, the culture of Canonical. When I joined Canonical in 2006, the culture was one of we're filled with great people who want to do really great work, and we just get on and do it. We don't have a lot of bureaucracy. You don't have to fill in 1,000 forms to get something done. You just get on and do it. And that culture is still there today. Nearly 650, 700 people. It's exactly the same culture at Canonical today. You just get on and do it. As an example, when I was running the community management team, we decided to build a developer website Most companies would not let a community management team do that. And we just went and did it. We threw up a WordPress and started working some things. Mike started writing an API CMS in his spare time. You just get on and do it. And I love that about Canonical. It's so refreshing. And of course, our community. You know, I mentioned that there were some people in the community that, frankly, we weren't particularly interested in their opinions, and that you'll have that with all communities. But by and large, the Ubuntu community is a wonderful, wonderful example of an open source community that does incredible things. And it's not just the community that does complementary things, that writes apps and writes scopes and tests. It's the community members like Scott Ritchie who challenges and test the waters and want to challenge the status quo in a way that is dignified and respectful. And we have a lot of people out there, and we absolutely need those people as well. Reasons to be cautious. Mark Shuttleworth. I said this earlier on. He's a great guy, but he's a founder, and he has founderitis, and therefore he will sometimes go after shiny things. He'll see something and like, let's get 100 people and work on this. And you've got to be careful when you get into a startup, when you're a startup, to not just always chase after the shiny things. One criticism I have a bit of Canonical is that I think Canonical spreads itself too thin in too many different areas. If you look at Launchpad and Bazaar and the cloud and phones and this, that, and the other, it's getting a lot better. It's much more constrained. I was really happy when we made the decision to just focus on the phone and not do the TV and the tablet at the same time. But it's, you know, it's definitely, you've got to be cautious about that. You know, I think the benefits far outweigh the disadvantages, but we can't ignore the disadvantages. Another reason to be cautious, the culture of Canonical. Canonical is an amazing company, but it is a clique. And I was involved in that clique, and I think we always, people at Canonical and people who work at Canonical, need to be a little bit mindful of that. And I'm as guilty as anyone for that. And it can be, it's like when you have a really, really passionate group of people, sometimes it can be difficult to see outside of that. Like when I left Canonical, I learned so much from leaving that I never saw when I was inside, because I didn't think I was biased, but I was massively biased. So, and I don't think that's Canonical. I think that's just, frankly, all startups. We also have to be cautious of deeply competitive markets. I read that statistic about there's, what, 1 billion Android phones or something like that on the market? And we've got, what, maybe 5,000 Ubuntu phones on the market. We're fighting some tall giants, and this is going to be very difficult to compete in these markets. The cloud is more accessible because it's much more within the Linux kind of world and the engineering side of things. The phone is way different. You know, we have a phone here that doesn't have WhatsApp on it. It doesn't have Skype on it. You can't make a Google Hangout on it. And it's going to take us time to get there, and that's going to be a very strategic and at times political route. It doesn't mean it's not going to succeed. I think there's a reasonable chance that it will succeed, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that, like, we are just the fact that Ubuntu's cool will not get us there. All right, so 5 predictions in 5 minutes. All of these are going to be wrong. Language is laughing because I showed him them this morning, and he disagrees with all of them. All right, so prediction number 1. I think the phone is actually going to exceed expectations in the short term. Now, this is, you got to take this with a pinch of salt because it defines what you mean by expectations. I'm not expecting it to go out there and outsell the Samsung Galaxy S6, okay? But I think that the expectation from a lot of people who are naysayers is it's going to die in its ass. And I don't think it will. I think that these flash sales are doing very well. I think the Meizu handset's going to be cool. I think we'll start seeing probably some more traction in China. But I think we're actually going to see some reasonably good results in the short term. That, to me, is the easy bit. It's getting to the medium term that's the hard bit. It's when you get to the consumer base that wants WhatsApp and wants Skype, that's going to be the hard bit. But I think in the short term, we're actually going to do reasonably well. I think already we're actually doing pretty well with this little device down here. Number 2, I think we're going to see continued growth in the cloud, but I think Canonical is going to struggle with telcos and governments. That one's for George. The reason why this is because I think that doing business with telcos and governments, invariably you have to be a really big company. And Canonical is a fairly large startup that is schizophrenic in 2 areas. There's a client side and there is a cloud side. And I think that's going to cause concern to telcos and governments. So I think it's going to be that's just a hard business to win as well. It's massively entrenched. There's so much regulation. And I think Canonical could get there, but it's going to take time. 3, I think we're going to see the entrance into new markets, wearables, connected home, and VR are my predictions on the client side. I think at some point you'll see an Ubuntu watch. I don't know that, I'm guessing, so don't write this down as fact. Hoping Veronic's not sat in here. I think connected home will be interesting. I think there will be a flirtation with VR, because VR is becoming a big thing. Yeah, so we'll see what happens. This is the let's put 100 people on shiny new things thing that I was talking about earlier on. Right. Right. I mean, like Unity running on all these things. Now, to completely contradict that one, I think that either the client or the cloud side is going to be shut down, sold, or dissolved. I don't think Canonical can maintain both divisions for a long time. I think, if anything, my guess would be the piece that will be sold off potentially will be the client side, just because it's a way bigger goal to be successful on the client side than it is on the cloud side. But like the cloud, there's a lot of startups, a lot of action on the cloud side. You can see what's going on with Docker and things like that. On the client side, like it's a David and Goliath kind of situation. So it wouldn't surprise me if the client piece will be sold to another company, either for the people or the assets. I don't know when. I think it will be more than 5 years' time, potentially, because I think Mark Shuttleworth will be involved for at least another 5 years. There was always a question when I was at Canonical of how long is he going to be involved? Like, the guy's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, right? You can just go around buying islands if you want to. But he spends his life working on this. And it could be, you worry that, this guy who's such a beacon for Ubuntu and Canonical could just get bored and move on and do something else. People have been predicting this for a long time. I think he's going to be around for at least another 5 years. And I think the reason is simple. He's having the time of his life. And frankly, he doesn't really need to care about money. He doesn't need Canonical to be successful financially. I think what he wants is success in the market. And I think that Canonical will be financially successful and is continuing to be financially successful. And I think that will keep his attraction, his interest there, is that he's getting to work on really cool things like Snappy Core and Ubuntu for phones and the cloud and Juju and all these different pieces. And he gets to surround himself with some of the best engineers in the world. All right, I'm pretty much done. I do have one more reminder. Get along to our thing tonight, 9 p.m., Bad Voltage Live. There's going to be some beer and some drinks there. You can win a laptop. You can see you're all going to be famous in a video. And you can win a System 76 laptop. So, all right, thank you for sticking around for an hour.